Although, like, to be fair, I think I'm doing articles way less on Substack. Um, so yeah. Um, yeah, this was actually I don't know how many of you folks are on YouTube. There's a creator I follow. Her name is Park Rose Permaculture, and she kind of talks about mostly politics. But she also talks about internet stuff, and like usually all that kind of runs and bleeds together, or I should say blends together. Um, and I guess there's this creator, Alex Lolo. Um, it's like LOL overruled is what it stands for. And he used to be a public defender. What's up, Nick? How you doing, bud? And so Alex Lolo used to be a public defender, and he's one of these leftist bros, and described himself as a feminist, that kind of thing. And then, of course, almost right on time, it came out, later that he'd, been just kind of an ass, and, like sent horrible pics to like you sent unsolicited or pics to women, and just all kinds of like horrible stuff. And this is also recently with, you know, a, a creator, former Denver Bronco that I found really entertaining, that I've liked for a long time, Shannon Sharpe, who recently settled, um, a civil suit for sexual assault allegations, and for $20 million. He was apparently, I don't know if dating's the appropriate word, because he's 57, and he was spending time with like a 19. She was 19 when he met her. She's 20 now. OnlyFans model. And I guess there was some audio, with some threats and pretty harsh language, and and so when it dropped, Shannon Sharpe said he was going to defend himself to the bitter end, and ended up settling for $20 million. Lost his $100 million contract with the ESPN, and yeah, and so and that always kind of puts you in a weird headspace if you're a dude, if it's one of your sort of like these people that you look up to, especially when they're like they're an entertainment because they put on this public persona, and you're like you find yourself getting in a place where you start making excuses for them. It's like, well, he's one of the greatest tight ends of all time, and well, what did she do, and all this other stuff. And I really want to unpack that, because there's really no point. For me, I always want to talk about like sort of the larger issues at play, because we're living through an environment where, while women are progressing socially, legally, they're losing their rights. And it was interesting, circling back to Park Rose Permaculture. She basically said, like, she doesn't trust any men on the left, until basically they prove themselves. And this is something I've heard. I'm not new to that. I've heard this before. It makes me sad every time I hear it, but unfortunately, it seems like this is the state of play, with women that are really on any side of the aisle. She made kind of an interesting claim, where, because she's formerly evangelical, formerly on the right, and she talked about, men over there, it's like they were absolutely sexist. They were absolutely horrible. But she trusted those men more than the leftists, because they're at least honest about their misogyny and their horribleness. And where with leftist men, it's like they put themselves in this veil of feminism, right? in this fighting for women's equality, but they're still steeped in misogyny. They haven't unpacked that, you know. And that is something that's really tough to unpack. And it's part of the reason I don't really call myself a feminist. And that's a multi-layered reason. I'll get into that in a minute. But that's kind of what I wanted to talk about is when we're living through this era of women losing a lot of their rights and being moved into second-class citizens, and Jeffrey Epstein, and why that's not like the victims aren't being put front and center, why this thing is being excused, that kind of thing, right? Like what this is me sort of maybe talking to men and working through what we need to do about it. Because men obviously are going to have to fix this. Like, at least on our side. I'm not talking about fixing it for women. That's why you'll rarely hear me or read about something that I say women should do. I don't feel like that's my place on what, like, I feel that I should absolutely be talking to men. Right? Hey, what's up, Dana? How you doing? And so I'll kind of unpack that a little bit. I'll kind of start with like sort of, if you haven't read any of my pieces, I talk about this at times where sort of my journey from moving from, trying to get more enlightened and really about, it's how this mindset, was there like really all along, but it's just sort of reframing it out of this sort of toxic masculinity. Yeah. So, that's my kitten just tearing something up. What are you tearing up? He's tearing something up. So he's got zoomies right now. I'm learning this with kittens and zoomies. It's definitely a thing, and he's definitely got them. He'll probably be joining us over here soon. His name is Momos, which I guess is Greek for dumpling, and that's why they named him. So it's male cat. So, what are you tearing up? Hmm? I think it's a carpet. I did get a kitten. It was my mother's kitten, and we tried to give her at the memory care unit. For those you don't know, recently my mother, she's been struggling with dementia for a while, and she had a fall, and it basically for dementia folks, like for folks with dementia, it can exacerbate the condition, and that's exactly what happened with her. And so, yeah. And so we got her a kitten to hopefully cheer her up, but she kept putting it out of the room. And so eventually we just had to take it back. And so I ended up getting him. I didn't want to give him away, and I was just like, I'll just take him. Yeah, I got a big enough downstairs. I'll take him in. So, he'll probably make an appearance. Normally, he's been kind of just hanging out in his little, whatever they call them, where they got the climbing gym thing, that's what they call them. And he just kind of hangs out while I talk, but he's been then getting zoomies when I start talking. So he's starting to do that. So he's an interesting little kitty. But, kind of like it's like the thing that I think really trips up men with women. And so if you guys haven't seen it, they're Gen XE, they do talks. That's with Dana Dubois and Lawrence Winterman, two good friends of mine that I've met on Substack. They had a talk with Dr. Amber Hall. And she's really good. So she kind of comes at this from both a sociological and a medical perspective. And there was a clip I caught. I haven't had a chance to watch their whole discussion, but she talked about men don't have enough platonic women friends for a lot of sociological sort of patriarchal reasons. And it doesn't allow you to, you know, it doesn't allow you to basically develop those muscles, those emotional muscles to essentially like be around women, right? And there's some truth to that. Like, actually, there's a lot of truth to that. And for me, it was changing sort of that patriarchal mindset of viewing women as people and not as things. Now, that sounds very simple, but it's really not, because for men, you you're not taught to view women as people. You're taught to view women as things, right? As in things of like either conquest or ego inflation or um like like an adornment, you know? Like you don't view them as you don't view them as people in and of themselves. That's the trick. Like that's the crux. So Sue Corrigan asks, like, you know, don't you always want to bang women? You know, like, can men even have female friends? Yeah, like, yes, if you sort of evolve past that, right? You have to evolve past this sort of patriarchal thinking, because part of talking about this objectification, right, is when you talk about objectification, when you talk about um, dehumanization, that's part of it, right? Is and that's sort of the interaction that we're shown, you know. And that's the thing that men struggle with, right? Is what we want, or what the manosphere and all this other stuff is trying to push back, sort of push back women's rights, is they want to push back women ultimately into a two-dimensional, like a parody of humanity, where they're not quite human. Because if you're not quite human, your feelings don't matter, your wants don't matter, your emotional needs don't matter. All these things that, that men are supposed to do, right? To be a contributor to a healthy relationship, we don't have to do. Because you see this a lot online. You see a lot of guys will say, you know, well, man, I'll go work and I'll pay the bills, like, and she can stay home and keep the house. Like, what's the problem with that? And they're being serious, right? Because if you're viewing this as purely team effort, right, and a division of labor, that absolutely, like on paper, makes sense. You've got one person of the team earning the economic income, and you've got the other person, you know, like taking care of the home front, right? To them, that's division of labor. Reality doesn't match up with that at all. Because even in a working relationship or a friendship, there are things that you need that you don't think about. Even among male friends, you have emotional needs. You might have, um, like everybody works in different ways, right? And so when you're starting to get intimate with another partner, base it's not as simple and clear cut, right? Especially with that kind of division of labor, and that's where the tension comes from. And again, because men are taught to approach women from this place of gender roles and this place of dehumanization, right? That women that they that is where the problems arise. because women are seeking to break out of those roles and become more actualized and human, to become more, more or less an equal, right? Versus, or at least have more of their humanity expressed rather than confined, because that's the privilege that men have had, right? So, you know, it that's where the struggle is. You've got to get past it. Sue had another question, is like, do you all do if you have male friends, do you potentially see women as like a potential lay? I mean, yeah, sometimes it depends. Um, but I've had female friends that no, I never did, you know. Um, and I think part of that is maturity. I think part of that is understanding that like your expression of masculinity is more than sticking your dick in somebody. Um, that you can have be friends platonically with women, and there are things that are fulfilling to that. Now, I don't have a lot of women friends myself. Um, you know, I have enough like male friends, but I've worked with women I respect. I've been colleagues with women. I've, been in business with women, you know, like there's no real issues there with that. Um, and there hasn't been like a sexual thought there, been like, yeah. It gets trickier when you're attracted to them, right? But again, there are some men that just because it's a woman, or she's a woman, they want to bang everything they see. Those type of men, that's something more psychologically with them, right? It's not necessarily, like it's not that's not a representation of all men, but that is kind of the stereotype that is pushed on us, that says, "Hey, this is what you're supposed to adhere to," right? Because again, women are things, right? They are things to satisfy your lust, right? It's when you start to view women as an end, you have to view women as an end in and of themselves and not a means to satisfying your lust, you know? And I mean, honestly, that can be tough sometimes, you know? That's why sex work exists. And, because the sex drive and testosterone is like, it's really, you know, it's a really powerful drive. You can't discount it, right? That's why porn is a billion-dollar industry. That's why sex work is a billion-dollar industry. It's not something that's probably going to go away. Um, the question is like, at that point, for those of you who I've had the fortune to befriend two really good early writers of Fusina Yudin and her partner Lena. I always butcher her last name. She's Hungarian. Um, if one of you kind people would put up their Substacks in the chat, I would appreciate it. They're great because they write about sex work. And that's one of the things that I'm not really against on Substack. I think that enhances the conversation um, about women, and that's because they write about it from a perspective of like of real objectification. With Fusen, like in Amsterdam, she's literally standing in a window, and backlit by a red light. And so, I mean, you're talking about at that point, like the ultimate objectification of a woman. But, you know, just like any other service worker, whether it's retail or labor, whatever, there's a human being there that's separate from their work. Unfortunately, their work involves using their body in very intimate ways. Like I used to be a laborer when I was in aviation or in the Marine Corps, and my body carries a lot of injuries from those times, So, like that was one of the fascinating things I saw. Like, there was a woman that was, talking about her OnlyFans, and it was in a military uh, Facebook, account or a group, right? And it's funny, you would think like, oh man, she's gonna get dragged by all these military guys. No, it was actually the opposite. They're like, hey, I fucked my back up, I fucked my knees up on road marches, on this, on that. It's like same shit, you know. We all give our body to the capitalist beast. It's like, damn, that's some enlightened thinking, you know. So, because I mean, yeah, like men, and that's what I think for men really need to understand in order to bridge that gap of thinking is we've everybody has been dehumanized and objectified in some way. Maybe not sexually, but you've been dehumanized in something. Whether that was your labor that you gave to the boss man and you got hurt and you still had to keep working, or you couldn't call in sick, or, you know, like you were tired and you were thirsty and and you kept going and they didn't care. We've all been there. And for men, when you start to think about the plight of women, because it is a plight of what's being done to them, and it's being done by men. You know, yeah, there are women that help with that, right? But men are the ones in power. Let's not forget that. You know, we've come from a patriarchal society. And it's not like we were matriarchal and then tables turned and there we go. No, you know, so but it's trying to like in thinking about that. Damn, I've been exploited. I've been dehumanized. I've been objectified. I didn't like that shit. Is that what I'm doing? Maybe. Yeah. You know, when you stop seeing, and that's the thing is like, that's what the entire manosphere right now is predicated on is and it's far beyond just like, showing a woman's ass or her boobs or like just objectifying her in that way, like a magazine layout. It's going a step further. And that's why it's dangerous. And that's why men need to talk about it. Is it's taking these, let's say these maybe bad examples, or like these women who are acting badly, or maybe taking them out of context and then presenting a framework around that to reinforce virulent misogyny. And what that does is, one, it further alienates you from any kind of love and affection, right? From women, for any hope of that. And two, it presents a false image of reality. That's why that shit's dangerous, And it goes further, right? You know, it's curious that every remedy after a breakup or after you get your heart broken for men is you got to go hit the gym, bro. Every day, I'll walk my dogs or whatever, and I carry my phone with me, and I listen to a lot of music on YouTube. I've done that pretty much since YouTube came out. So I'll just find like a playlist or a song, and there it is. And every commercial that's targeted at me, because of my age, is trying to target this loss of manhood that is common at men my age at 48, And so like the commercial I get now, which is going hot and heavy, which is like, are you a man who makes $150,000 a year, but you don't like how you look? We can help you get shredded, or, you don't pay anything. Like I've heard that the start of that commercial before I had skip so many damn times. That's the same Manosphere crap, you know? It's like, "Oh, okay." Like, you're just gonna friggin' get me some testosterone placement therapy and, like, have me go to the gym and do the fake tan and everything else, and it's like and then frickin', kill my, my lifespan on the back end by, 10, 20, 15, 25 years. Yeah, I'm good, bro. Now, I can say that because my problem is the opposite. I'm a pretty big dude. Like, I'm 6'5" right now. Right now, I'm currently at 357 pounds, you know, and I got really broad shoulders. People ask me, is like, "Hey, man, did you ever play NFL football?" I'm like, "No, I'm just a big dude," you know. And but and the other commercial I see is one for because I watch a lot of cooking stuff because I cook at home, or I try to. Let's put it that way. Um, is for the real manly knife. It's like, it's like this knife will cut through bone and blah blah blah. And they got the meat, and it's like it's outdoors and they're slicing off the ribs and stuff. And I'm like, oh dear God, like okay, you know, it's like it ain't got to be all that, bro. um, or it's the women from a um horrible circumstances in another country. You know what I mean? Like like Ukrainian thing is like Ukrainian women are looking for middle-aged American men or Filipino women, you know, never get African woman though. I think it's because they know I'm white. So it's just I'm like, but if you're gonna sell me on the mail order bride, I would like all colors of the rainbow algorithm, please. You know, I know they say is like the dating preference is supposed to be within your, you know, oh yeah, so yeah, mail order brides are still very much a thing. You know, nowadays like the men that get into that they call them passport bros. That's what they call themselves. They're passport bros, and their thing is American women are so broken by feminism they have to go overseas to get a respectful and subservient woman, and that's the thing. So it's like, not understanding that there's going to be cultural differences that's really going to make that, really going to make that a challenge that they're not absolutely prepared for. And the other thing is too, is like people are people. At some point, they're going to get tired of being, uh, exploited and repressed. It's not going to work. But yeah, I mean, but that's really why I don't call myself a feminist. Um, because I'm not a feminist. And I don't really think men can be feminists. I'm not against other men calling themselves that, you know, but, and again, this comes from my sort of academic background. I'm very careful about how I use labels, because labels mean things, words mean things, you know. And for me, it's like when you talk about feminism, you're either talking about two things. One, you're talking about the philosophy and sort of that the school of thought around feminism, right? And that which there's different waves for it. You know, there's different understandings depending on the era you're in. So second wave with Andrea Dworkin is very different from third and fourth wave. I think we're in fourth wave now. Like Jessica Valenti's part of that new wave. Um, and like, and I've read feminist. I've read Andrea Dworkin. I've read Ariel Levy. I've read Jessica Valenti. I met her sister. You know, and but really the philosophy about it is really understanding, what's women's place post patriarchy in the patriarchy, what they should be. And there's disagreements. Like for Andrea Dworkin, um, pornography and sex work was rape. It was, you know, it was exploitation. And there's other women that they don't see that, or well, let me just say that they disagree with it, you know. And so, they think that, you know, the they think it's the same as repression of sex, right? Not with everything that human beings do, right? They it's messy and complex, right? There's no one correct answer. You don't just line up on either side and say, boom. The other thing with feminism is the political aspect of it, right? And that's a very simple concept is, women should be treated equally under the law, you know. And there's different ways to kind of like what you're talking about, right? Because you're really talking like more about equity than equality, right? Because equality across the board doesn't really work if the system is inherently patriarchal, because if you're trying to change that system, women are obviously going to have, more needs like than men might, right? So that's why you have Title IX. That's why you have, um, like there's not saying that men don't have needs, but that's why there's more, um, women's shelters, there's like, there's laws designed to protect women that have been, um, victims of assault. It's recognizing that difference in order to reach equity, right? So you can't treat like women the same as men, right? It's more about fairness than it is about like, just flat out equality, or you can't treat like equality as in being the same. So, but the thing is, I don't like for me, I don't one like if we're talking about like the philosophy of feminism, well, I find it interesting, and I've read it in order to understand more, to get a more complete picture, right? Um, of humanity. Then like, yeah, I find it interesting, but I'm not a feminist because my journey is trying to understand how to be a better man, you know. And unfortunately, all my words, right, are essentially corrupt. Like I can't refer to myself as a masculinist, as someone who is studying manhood and how, we got to this patriarchy, how we can detach, how we can be better men. That's masculinist, meninist, all that stuff is loaded with far right interpretation. So I can't even use that, right? And even describing myself. But essentially that's what I am, you know. And personally, and I have talked to men, like I have led men in heavily masculine fields. I have been at the top end of frontline management, even on the lower end of middle and moving towards C-suite. And I have talked to, like, are you talking aviation, the military, you know, like you these guys, like the answer is not, let's just be feminist. That's not gonna work. Like, and I know that's like there was a push for that years ago where it's like, oh, just call yourself a feminist. It's like, yeah, but that's not gonna work. Because identity and words mean things. And for people, they're very important. You know, that's why no label stuff doesn't work. People need labels. Absolutely. MAGA is an example of a label. From a marketing standpoint, it's brilliant. It's brilliant from a marketing standpoint. It sounds like mega, you know, MAGA, making America great again. Yeah. And for people that are desperate, you know, for identity, Yeah, my man Nick Paro he's got an acronym we're working on called RISE, you know, which is restoring integrity, service, and you know, um brain fart is like it's ethics. There it is, you know, which I love ethics. You know. That was one of the most profound things when I was studying philosophy. And I found out I was more of an ethicist than anything else is like had a professor tell me, he says, listen, like it's great that you want to study like how the mind works, if we have a soul, all these existential questions or maybe even metaphysical questions. But to me, the core reason you should study philosophy is learning how to be a better human being and how to live in society. That's ethics. Absolutely. You know, for me, if it doesn't have a practical application, that's why you hear me talk about Stoicism a lot, sometimes Buddhism, you know, is if it doesn't have a practical application for your life, where it can't, if it's just some, sort of high kind of minded academia that can't help you in day to day, it has like basically it has to have utility. But the labels are important, you know. That's why people in America, right? You see poll after poll after poll or survey after survey after survey, right? Is they agree with supposedly democratic or liberal leaning policy positions. But when it comes to taking the label of liberal or Democrat, no, because it has such a negative connotation. Because the right has anchored that to this horrible caricature that people don't want to associate with, you know? And so, the thing is like, are you going to get a bunch of guys that you're trying to convince them to unpack this patriarchal thinking that, they don't think is wrong, that they'd never even question it because you got to understand, it's like an autonomic function to them. It just is. It's like somebody that's been told God is real their entire life. And then you're trying to get them to question that. The fight or flight reflex is going to kick in. You're not going to get them to slap feminist on themselves. They like, you know, because that doesn't, even the word doesn't even give you a place. Right. So while I think it's well intentioned and I understand, like why certain activists tried to do that, one, to be inclusive, and two, to really kind of like change the conversation, you know, is it ultimately failed and it's always going to fail because men need to understand where they're failing, especially women, is they need to find an identity outside of like what is the like beyond the patriarchy, what comes next. And right now, like there's very few voices, there's very few men that are doing that. They're not doing that. All this manosphere stuff, no. All that's going to do is make them more lonely and broke because most of these people are grifters. That's what's going to happen, you know. And the tough part about it is like if it's about finding your humanity, and that's ultimately what it is finding their humanity, is understanding that this little box that they find themselves in, this masculinist, traditional masculinity box, right, is so fucking narrow. And how they interact with women in their lives is so limiting, you know, because when you're saying, oh, my wife needs to do this, and the woman needs to do this, and this, and this, it's like, okay, but Why can't like you? So you're not gonna understand what that what that experience is like. You're gonna close yourself off from that. I'm not saying you need to have every experience under the sun for humanity, right? But you don't think that understanding what a housewife would go through in a day and all the work they do, like, would help you get closer to your wife? You don't think understanding, like, damn, this is what the patriarch is like, or listening, just even listening to a woman. Hey, is what I went, this is what I went through when I was a teenager. Because it's vastly different from what I went through, you know. In another video I had where I talked about, dating in the 90s when I was a young man, because I was pretty buck wild from about like 18 to about 23, you know. Like I got all my craziness in about 5 years. And then I met my wife, at that time, or the woman who would become a wife. And that was it. And that's kind of how it was. I went buck wild, met a woman, settled down, got married, and I was like, okay. And then by the time I got to the other side, but we got divorced, um, I came out the other end and I was, like 31. And I was just like, it's like that, it's like that Hank Williams Jr. song. All my rowdy friends have settled down. It's like, yeah. And I was too old to get rowdy like I used to. Mm-mm. But I mean, when I was 16, I think my third date, I went out with a woman that was our young, we were no, young girl. And she was like, oh yeah, I had sex at 14 and I've had plenty of sex since then. Blew me away. So I think I'd kissed like two girls at that point, you know? I mean, the first girl, I was too terrified to kiss when I was in seventh grade. I was just like, oh, like, no, it's like, and it wasn't until years later I was like, damn, 14? What the hell, man? Like, shit, you know? And yeah. And even then, when I was younger, man, it's like women who were, you know, I don't want to say sexually aggressive, but who were open about their sexuality scared the living shit out of me. And that was because, right, is um like that was because I was taught to be afraid. I was like, ooh, you don't want to mess with them women, you know. Well, those are the bad women. And that was kind of ingrained to me at a young age. Even though I wanted to have sex with every damn woman I saw, you know, at about 19 years old, around my age, you know. Sue asks, what do you think it would be? The motivation to look deeper, be human when they are dominant and have free labor and sex? I mean, some men are never going to look past that, right? And those are the ones that are lamenting that, they don't get that anymore by right. Like it's a birthright. And that's all they want. They just want to be dominant. And they want to have free labor and sex. Another creator that I've had lives with is Larissa Reinhardt, and she talks about that. That basically it's part of the reason that men are upset and furious is they're not getting this free domestic labor anymore. I agree, and I agree with that. I think my argument to those men would be like, but what do you like? What do you really want? Because for a lot of men, even with that, if you dig deeper, right? Most people, unless you're like, and this is me sort of, this is me taking in Viktor Frankl, right? I think most people want love. right? Most people deep down crave it unless they're, damaged and maladjusted. They have like severe psychological issues like Trump. Um, and pretty much Epstein and everybody else that exploited those young women or young girls. But I think most people want love and want to like because when you even in the manosphere when you hear about it and when they talk about it, what do they talk about? They talk about aspects of love, right? Well, I want loyalty. Really, what you talk about there is fidelity, right? You want someone you can depend on. That's really what that means, you know. Because when you dig down into it with loyalty, that's really what like you talk to guys when you ask them, and I have. What do you mean by loyalty? You know, well, man, I want somebody to be there for me when the chips are down. Okay, so you want fidelity, you want support, right? You know, it's like okay, you know, what else do you want? It's like, well, man, it's like, I'd like her to be, to show gratitude. Okay, yeah, we all want gratitude. You know, nobody likes ingratitude. Everybody wants reciprocation. You know, like to me, like ingratitude is probably one of the worst sins you can commit. You know, it's like it's one of the like very few human traits that's like culturally universal. You know, it's like what else? It's like, well, I'd like some affection. Okay, well, and a lot of times with men because we express this differently because we're taught this is all you can express it with is physical, right? To Dr. Amber Hull's point, right? We're not taught the emotional side, which we're not taught that I really want this, right? You know, physical touch is just one part of intimacy. But because the other ones have been feminized and we're supposed to, fit in this sort of narrow box of like, you know, like, nah, you don't need that. Da, da, da. It's like you gotta cut that emotion out. And it's like, all that stuff, you know, is you are looped by adhering to this very narrow, I want to be dominant and have free sex and labor. Or, you're missing out on really what you truly want. On what you truly want. You're missing out, you know. And so you don't get those deeper connections. You don't get that um you miss out on that. And eventually because like you haven't taken your relationship to that deeper level, then that's why they die over time. Cuz eventually one partner wants more, you know. That's why women leave. And a lot and besides there's all kinds of other financial, safety issues. But a big reason is like it's just, you know, they don't have that. And after a while, at first you ask for change and then you beg for it and then you get angry about it. And then eventually the most is severed and then you're done, you know? So, and I think that's the struggle with men today, you know. We're not taught how to do those things, you know. So, and then what ends up happening is you you end up hurting people, whether, inadvertently or deliberately. And usually those people are women. So, yeah. And that's the thing is like, from time to time or more often, men need to speak on this stuff, man. You know, and there's examples throughout history where leaders talked about gentleness as part of manliness. It's a part of it's. I mean, honestly, like I've gotten further with men with empathy and kindness and you know than I ever did with barking and being alpha. Way more. And it's funny. Every station I ever went to work for, right? They all told me the same thing. It was all bullshit. Man, you gotta go out there and be tough. You're a manager. You gotta go out there and show them who's boss, and you gotta freaking rare, 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 that kind of stuff. And at my first one, I said, I don't think that works. And so, I practiced more firm but fair, right? I showed kindness and empathy when I could, and I got way further with those and was a better manager because I respected people. I respected their input. You know, there are times when you were a leader, you had to make a decision and you had to be the one to make it. But that didn't mean you couldn't listen to people. That didn't mean you couldn't admit mistakes, you know. And the thing is, like, what I would tell men, guys, you're capable. You're more capable than this. What these fools, you know, these so-called alpha males, this so-called manosphere, this patriarchy, what it's asking you to do is really diminish yourself by not allowing LGBTQ folks into the fold of manhood, by not allowing trans men into the fold of manhood, by not trying to understand the plight of women and what they're going through and how you're being asked to diminish yourself, to limit yourself. You're capable of a hell of a lot more. That's what being a man's about. Right? It's realizing your full potential as a human being. You know, it's yeah, man. There's gonna be differences, between men and women and how we've come through the world, biologically speaking, you name it. But that doesn't mean they're less than you. It's just different. It's a different expression of humanity. That's it. And when you allow for other folks and other expressions, non-binary, LGBTQ, trans folks, you name it, women, when you allow for that expression to flourish and take hold, what that does is give you a better understanding, a much fuller scope of humanity. When you repress it, when you diminish it, when you dehumanize it, even the word dehumanization, you're taking it away. It's not going to help you. It's not going to ultimately get you what you want, especially if you want love, and especially if you want happiness, which to me, I think full happiness comes from being able to fully express yourself as a human being. So that was my soapbox for today. This is something I had to get off my chest. So, but yeah. Anyway, you know, thank you all for coming in. I appreciate you letting me get that off my chest and talk at you a little bit. It's always appreciated. Anyway, that's all I got for you. Keep the faith. Defend democracy. I'll see you later.